Welcome to this evening's Foreign Policy Association panel, the U.S. presidential election, taking stock and looking ahead. My name is Steven Zelizer. I am a fellow at the Century Association here in New York. Well, this is certainly a hot subject for our time. It seems to involve practically everything. A rematch between an incumbent president and his predecessor, the first time since 1912. It also involves two old guys, two unpopular candidates, vast ideological differences, criminal trials, disinformation, impeachments, insurrections, threats of mayhem, possible bloodshed, global wars, and deep uncertainty about our own democracy's survival. And this is already with still 7 months to go before the election. In any case, we are very privileged to have two distinguished speakers for the panel tonight, whom I am certain will illuminate this extraordinary race and will either reassure us or plunge us into even greater depression. Each will make an opening statement, but before I get to the speakers, a few housekeeping details. This is an hour-long program, so we will try to cover a lot in this time. Second, as customary, we'll have a question period after I've done with my own questions. At that time, please keep your questions short and to the point, no lectures, but a microphone will be provided. Third, there will be a reception after the event outside this auditorium. Now, let me introduce our two panelists, and then we'll get to their statements. First, in the center, Professor Julian Zelizer, who is a presidential historian at Princeton, the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Professor of History and Public Affairs at the Princeton School for Public and International Affairs. He's also the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of some 25 books. I just learned that tonight. I thought it was 15, but it's actually 25. And he's a contributor to CNN. Second is Gerard Baker at my extreme left, not his political left, but he is he is the editor-at-large at the Wall Street Journal. Previously, he worked for the BBC and the Financial Times. In 2009, he joined the Wall Street Journal as deputy editor-in-chief, and by 2013 was the newspaper's editor-in-chief, where he stayed for 5 years. He is, as I said, now a editor-at-large. Mr. Baker was born in Great Britain, but as I understand, he became an American citizen last December. So with those words, I will start with Professor Zelizer.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction, to be with you on the panel and for having us. So I just thought of a few remarks. There's a lot to talk about with the election. There's many angles, and we can go in many directions. But I'd just start off, I had a few thoughts, given the association we're here with, on will and how might foreign policy be part of the election. Conventional wisdom, if you ask any American politics scholar, is foreign policy usually doesn't matter in an election, ranks low, voters don't care unless you're in a major conflict, and even then, it's not necessarily going to sway the election. But I think we can see in 2024 there are ways in which foreign policy could very well play a role in how this unfolds. And I just wanted to lay out a few of them. Obviously, one will have to do with the Middle East. Certainly within the Democratic Party, we've already seen fissures emerging and tensions emerging over the war with Israel and Gaza right now. There's been kind of tests of how this might play out in the electorate with the uncommitted vote in Michigan, with tensions that emerged after Senator Schumer's statement. And it's unlikely, although always possible, that this will be resolved come October and November. But assuming it's not, it's clearly going to be a source of strain within the Democratic Party, which will raise the question of, does it have the impact of either deflating some of the vote that will be essential for Democrats in swing states where slivers of voters will matter? Does it impact perceptions of President Biden and how he handles not just foreign policy, but governing Does it create impressions that he is not kind of as skilled among parts of the electorate as he claims to be, not just with this issue, but in general? So I think the Middle East is different than some other foreign policy issues, and it also has a kind of emotional resonance with different parts of the electorate that it goes beyond it being a foreign policy issue. And so I think for all those reasons, I would assume this will be important. We've seen this before in 1967, for example, after the Six-Day War. This became a big fault line in kind of the progressive coalition within the Democratic Party, with divisions opening up over Israel, including between black and white progressives during that period. Second, Ukraine, I don't think will be irrelevant in the election. There's an issue that not only has become for Biden symbolically important and policy-wise very important in terms of his vision of foreign policy and arguments that he has made about global autocratic threats and his administration's commitment to stop them within the Republican Party. This is now emerging also as a point of tension that I don't think will go away as the election heats up. We're seeing the party right now with the spending battles that have taken place on Capitol Hill really wrestle over a party that in 2012, when Mitt Romney was running, it was hard to imagine they'd be in this position in terms of not providing assistance to Ukraine. It's entered into the election with former President Trump putting a lot of pressure on members of the House and Senate caucus to back away from some of this funding. So I think these tensions also will be part of the campaign trail, and very possible, I'm not a foreign policy expert, but that the intensity of the battle escalates, which will make it more of a campaign issue here in the United States. Third, I think foreign policy always matters, even though people say it doesn't. I believe that even if specific issues are not necessarily ranked at the top of what voters care about, people read leaders in terms of what they see in the news at some level and how they handle these issues. It's not a total surprise that some of President Biden's polls started to fall and he started to struggle after the Afghanistan pullout and kind of what happened during that aftermath. And I believe at some level voters are paying attention, not necessarily to all the specifics, but this is a gauge of his promise in 2020, that he could create stability, he could bring a level of governance, he could bring a level of competence that the former president did not. So I think this is something to watch as it unfolds. And there's campaigns where this mattered. I mean, Harry Truman / Adlai Stevenson in 1952, that election was affected by anti-communism in Korea. Hubert Humphrey in 1968. Vietnam was front and center in the problems that he faced. And I don't imagine this is an election that escapes those kinds of pressures, even if we're not in a ground war, even if the magnitude is not as great as it was. We live in a different era in terms of information and news that will keep putting these questions on the campaign trail. And finally, I think foreign policy is creating instability in an already unstable election, and that will put pressure on both candidates. I think you just outlined a kind of million reasons why this is an unusual election, and there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how this will unfold. And we have very dynamic events happening both in the Middle East and Ukraine, and who knows where else, that will continue to alter and change the tenor of the campaign. And I think this will be a challenge for President Biden, who is going to have to adjust, and there will be pressure to get out there and have positions and respond as events on the ground unfold. And so part of the test for President Biden will be a much more dynamic, I think, election than even really 2000 was, when COVID was the issue that dominated the way the campaign unfolded. And it will obviously present challenges for the former president, who is not as bothered by these kinds of things and is willing to kind of get out there and say what he wants. But I do think even with issues like Ukraine, it can cause complications that he might not be expecting at this point. So those are a few ways in which I think foreign policy is also part of this big mix in the election stew that we are about to all witness, taste, and be part of in the next few months.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I agree with almost all of that, and that's a very, very helpful introduction. Thank you, first of all, for coming along, and thank you for inviting me to the Foreign Policy Association. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I thought, Stephen, your introduction, the way you laid out in rather lurid terms the context in which this election, and the historical context in which this election is taking place, could not be bettered, really. I wrote earlier this year that the contest that we seem to have between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, which we do have between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, is a contest between the incapable and the unspeakable. And I think as your summation, I think was a little more detailed, a little more colourful. So what I want to do is just briefly, and again, I'll try not to overlap with what the Professor just said, but to lay out, I think we're just a little bit over 7 months away from the election. We know it's close, every single election. I think I've written again a bit about this, and I'd love to know, I'd be interested in the Professor's views actually, but it does seem the United States is cursed not only with hyper-polarized politics, but with an extraordinarily evenly balanced hyper-polarized politics, where every election comes down to a few percentage points. If you look at the history, the second half of the 20th century, presidents won elections with landslide after landslide. LBJ and Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush all won huge majorities of the popular vote and huge majorities of the electoral vote. Since 1992, we've just not really had anything like that. The biggest victory we know was Barack Obama's in 2008. No, even that, he only got 51-52% of the vote. So I think one of the challenges this country really has is not just the polarization, obviously the extreme polarization, but again this strange phenomenon whereby every election seems to be on a knife edge, and not just presidential elections now, but we've got a 51-49 majority in the Senate. We've got basically a 1 or 2 seat majority in the House, and I don't see much prospect in the next 7 months of politics unfolding in a way that is going to fundamentally break with that pattern of a very, very, very deadlocked country and an evenly split country, whatever the result is. But I just want to I'll just point up, as the campaign really unfolds, and again, we are a little bit over 7 months. A lot can happen in 7 months. We all know that. We can go back and look at opinion polls at this stage of each election year for the last 20, 40 years, and things do change significantly. So we should not assume that what the polls currently tell us will in fact be realized on election day. But I'd point to, as we look at the election, I'd point to 4 key variables. There are many variables, obviously, that will determine the outcome of any election. But I think there are 4 key variables that I would point to, and for us to all look at as the election as the campaign takes place over the next 7 months. The first is the issues. It's a striking thing that while we in the media sort of particularly kind of fixate a lot on personalities and character, the age of President Biden, the personal character and flaws of Donald Trump, it is striking that issues are actually important, at least if you look at the polls. The polling says that the saliency of these key issues that confront the country is high in voters' minds, and if you look at those issues, they can all change in ways that could work to the benefit of one or the other candidate over the next 7 months. But I would say right now the issues seem to favor Donald Trump somewhat. if you look again, just taking the opinion polls insofar as we can trust opinion polls in terms of how they rate the key issues in terms of importance to voters, immigration is ranked now quite routinely #1, which is historically unusual. It's usually the economy #1, occasionally, as after 9/11 or in the middle of wars, foreign policy. But right now, immigration is #1, and I don't think there's much doubt that if you look at the polls, that Joe Biden gets very low marks on immigration, and that is a real problem for him, and I don't see that's fundamentally changing in the next 6 or 7 months. The second big issue is obviously the economy, and while this debate goes on about how strong the U.S. economy is, growth is strong, unemployment is still relatively low, people still do give Joe Biden low marks on the economy because of inflation, particularly because of the increase in the price level over the last 3 years. And now that could change because we could continue to see price inflation moderate. We could see more focus on the positive parts of the economy. Unemployment could continue to stay low. Interest rates could come down over the next 6 months, which will help. But that's the second big issue. And I think which merits watching. And the third big issue is, and I won't dwell on it because the professor's just outlined it admirably, but are the foreign policy questions and what happens in the Middle East in particular. And I'll come on to some other related issues later in my opening remarks. But obviously what happens in Ukraine and, God forbid, should something else happen or these conflicts escalate. And I think there we'd have to see. I don't know what the implications would be politically. When you have a foreign policy crisis, there does historically tend to be a kind of a rallying around the president. Again, it's hard to know whether that would happen this time. But so I think the issues are the first basket of topics that I would say are going to be critical in determining the outcome of the election. The second is the character issue, is the personality issue. Obviously, I think it matters. It always matters. We know that in every single presidential election. Sometimes it does seem to trump issues and other factors. This time it obviously is extremely important because you have on the one hand the oldest incumbent president running for re-election we've ever had, and with, again, we can talk about it, but with some obvious frailties, and he will be 86 at the end of his next term. Remarkable numbers of people responding to opinion polls believe he's too old to be president, shouldn't be running for president, including very large numbers of Democrats. So the Biden's age is clearly going to be an issue. Should there be some new evidence of his frailty, of cognitive issues or anything like that, that could be very problematic for him. And I think that's something that we have to weigh up. But you've got age on the one hand and a very old president on the other hand versus a man of significant character, not to mention legal and other problems on the other in the form of Donald Trump. And how that plays out, obviously how these legal cases play out, I think on the whole so far, these cases have rather served to help Donald Trump. Certainly in the Republican primary, I think they've created, whether you agree with it or not, a sense among Republicans that the president has been persecuted by political enemies. But whether or not that actually plays with the wider electorate, I don't know. The evidence, the polling evidence continues to be a significant number of voters say if Donald Trump is convicted in any of these criminal cases, that would make them significantly less likely to vote for him. We'll have to see. We don't know. A, we don't know whether we'll ever get to a conviction before we'll ever get even to a trial before the election. And B, we don't know even if we did what the result would be. But that interplay between Biden's principal weakness, his age, and Trump's principal weakness, which is the whole panoply of legal and January 6th and characteriological issues that bedevil and trail Donald Trump wherever he goes. That's, I think, the second key variable, and how those factors interplay is going to be a second key variable in the determining the outcome of the election. The third is, and I think this may or may not loom large. I think it does loom larger than it has in the recent past, and that is the prospect of a third-party candidate, or let's say of a candidate from other than the two main parties. We've never seen an election in which, certainly not in modern polling days, in which voters express dissatisfaction with both such dissatisfaction with both the leading candidates. We've never had an election where the likability, the favorability rates among voters of the two main candidates are in the low 30s, the low 30s. We've never had anything like that before. this is the election, as various people have said, this is the election that kind of everybody expected and very few people actually wanted. And that does, I think, lay the groundwork for the possibility of a third-party candidate. We've already seen, obviously, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who does seem to be gaining some traction right now, just announced his running mate, actually, today. Polling in the 10 to 15% range. Does look like he'll get ballot access probably in most states. But I'm a little skeptical about Kennedy because I think there are, I think right now, the people expressing a desire or willingness to vote for him are probably more expressing dissatisfaction and disgust with the two main candidates rather than actually examining Kennedy and what he stands for, and frankly some of the kind of slightly curious, put it mildly and politely, things that he's said about a number of issues. I think if he did get more scrutiny, I'm not sure his vote would hold up. The question, though, is, would there be another candidate, a third? We're all familiar with the no labels movement and this attempt to get a a non-partisan candidate to run and to come through the middle. I know there's a view among some pollsters that there's a that candidate would have a very strong possibility. People talked about Joe Manchin for a while. Senator Joe Manchin, he's not going to do it. People thought maybe Nikki Haley, when she lost the Republican nomination, that she would be a strong candidate, and the polling indicates she would. Kristen Sinema, the Democrat, formerly Democrat, now independent senator from Arizona, who has announced she's standing down. There are names out there, and she's also said she won't run, but there are names out there, and there are at least one can conceive of, we're getting quite close now, and will be issues of ballot access and things like that, but there are still people out there who I think would be able to command a significant share of the vote. And remember, don't ever forget, and I was here, not living here, but I came and covered the 1992 presidential election, when Ross Perot ended up with 20% of the vote. He had been running in that summer before he initially pulled out. You'll recall he pulled out of that campaign after some rather odd remarks that he'd made. He was running ahead of both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in the early summer, in June and early July of 1992. And he pulled out in sort of, I'd say, rather odd circumstances, came back into the race very late, and still got he got 19.5% of the vote. I think the level of dissatisfaction with the two main candidates that we have right now, and that historical record, and of course you go back further to a century earlier to see how politics can be influenced by third-party candidates. So I wouldn't rule that out, and I still think it's possible, again, that would be the third variable that could have a significant impact on the outcome. And the fourth and final variable is, and I apologize for putting it in these terms, but it's what Donald Rumsfeld famously used to call, the unknown unknowns. I've gone through, I think, and the professor's gone through some of the known unknowns, but there could be all kinds of things in the foreign policy field. Certainly, interestingly, I've been interviewing today for my podcast a former Afghan general, talking about the rise of this ISIS-K, this sort of successor to ISIS in Afghanistan that seems to have carried out this terrible terrorist attack in Moscow last weekend. They are clearly intent on, we've sort of thankfully not had to worry too much about Islamist terrorism in the last few years, especially since the defeat of ISIS a few years ago. But a terrorist attack, what effect could that have, especially if it came out of Afghanistan, where Joe Biden gets very, very low remarks, very, very low marks from voters, especially if it came someone coming across the border as an illegal migrant, something like that. I think that could have a dramatic effect. What if there's some either of the candidates, who both of them are quite elderly, had a health event or an issue like that? What if God forbid there should be some act of political violence? This country has long sad history of political violence, and you remember 1968, that election year, and the kind of extraordinary scenes we witnessed, not just assassinations, of course, but the violence and the unrest at the Democratic Convention. What could these, as we enter this very, very volatile, turbulent period where, one side, with some reason, thinks democracy is under threat if one candidate wins, where the other side thinks they're going to lose their country if it wins. I fear, and I don't want to be alarmist, but I fear the risk of something domestic, let alone foreign, that could bubble up and could really disrupt the campaign is a real possibility. So anyway, those I think there are many other variables. There are the 4 variables that are most in the front of my mind as I look forward to the election. Look forward. Let me rephrase that. As I ponder the election campaign, those are the sort of 4 key variables that I think we should keep an eye on.
Okay, well, I will open the questions with a few of my own, and then we'll go to the audience. First, Professor Zelizer, what do you think are Biden's strongest issues in this campaign, and what are Trump's strongest issues?
Well, I mean, one of Biden's strongest issue is not translating into the strong issue. So it's a dilemma. I mean, I do think the argument that the economy is in pretty good shape and it's much better than it was the Reagan question 4 years ago is true by most indicators, but it's not playing out that way. So different explanations, whether it's elements of how the media works to that the numbers don't capture an underlying anxiety, a post-pandemic anxiety that exists. So I think that is still his strongest issue, and I don't know if there will be a way to capitalize. I think normality still is the biggest issue he sells. I mean, I think in 2020 there were many reasons he was appealing. Not many, but there were few reasons he was appealing. But the biggest was he would reestablish a kind of traditional form of governance and leadership that had certainly been absent for 4 years. And that stability is something that's often desired by different parts of the electorate, whether it's the business community, whether it's average voters who are tired and unhappy with the kind of chaos. Kind of a chaos presidency is not what they wanted. And I think for all his problems and for all the challenges, he's delivered on that to some extent. And I think that's still a selling point for him. And I think the other selling point for 2020 is still something we are going to hear, that he should energize Democrats because he can beat Donald Trump. And meaning the come out to vote is not because you love him, but because he is the vehicle to prevent a second Trump term. And I think that is a selling point that his surrogates will certainly emphasize, and I think he will emphasize as well. And then there, I mean, I think your point on issues is important. There are a lot of issues right now where he still has many months. I don't know if he's going to overcome kind of polling problems with immigration, especially the Senate deal is not happening. So that's going to be hard. There are other issues which he can sell. Certainly, as we just saw in the election, you know, reproductive rights is a big issue, not just in blue states, but even in parts of red states. And the more he can connect his administration to a kind of defense or a firewall against further erosion of these rights, I do think that's a strong point for him. It's not him, but that's where the party is in a good position vis-a-vis the Republicans. So those are a few.
Do you mind if I just quickly respond? So, I mean, on the economy, I do think it's quite important to interject, and I apologize, but it's not really true, as some people would like to have you believe, that the people's perceptions of the economy are somehow wildly off and have been skewed by right-wing media because the economy is great and it's fantastic and they just keep watching Fox News and getting told it's not. Just the most simple statistic is since January 2021, the overall price level, you can take various indices, but let's take the consumer price index, is up by 21% since January 2021. Real wages in that time have risen by about 18.5%. So in other words, people have seen a real decline in their standard of living, in their incomes, and that affects everybody. The thing about unemployment, even when you have a recession in this country, I mean, if we had a recession in this country, unemployment would go from its current 3.9% to 6 or 7%. One in 16 people, as terrible as unemployment is, it affects 1 in 16 people. When prices go up, when people walk into the supermarket and see, as I did the other day, a half gallon of milk for $9.50, they're not stupid. They're not sort of not seeing reality. They are seeing reality, and they are seeing that prices have gone up and that their income has not gone up by as much. So that's, I think it is. and the Biden people keep deluding themselves with this talk that, oh, it's all the fault of the right-wing media for telling people things aren't good. You know, you can't, it's, you know, that's a line about, you know, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? I think the other thing I would quickly say is that I think where I do agree with the professor is, and in fact, talking to the Biden team, they think the issue that will win them the election, and who's to say they're wrong, is democracy and the future of democracy. And they think that concerns about Donald Trump and what he did after the last election and what happened on January the 6th and what he stands for, what he seems to stand for in terms of his refusal to accept the results of an election, will in the end sway enough voters in key states, particularly, you know, college-educated voters in key suburbs in key states, to win the election. And again, I think that, you know, that's not a bad bet. I think there are a lot of people who, whatever they concern about the economy, whatever they think about immigration, may think, you know what, I'm just not prepared to take that chance with Donald Trump.
And that means, just to follow on that, Trump is actually the biggest and strongest issue for Biden. It's Trump. And the more that he is front and center, and the more these concerns are front and center, at least the Biden team thinks, and with reason, that's the best kind of foundation for a successful campaign.
All right, now we've talked about Biden's strongest issues. How about Trump's strongest issues?
You're going to start with him?
Okay,
Well, I'll be brief because I took part of your time. I mean, I think immigration is unquestionably the strongest issue. People are, you know, Biden gets an approval rating of about 30% on immigration. And Trump only has to say things that, you know, there have been, the estimates vary, but even at an absolute minimum, the number of illegal border crossings that there have been since Joe Biden became president just over 3 years ago is at least 7 or 8 million, could be as high as 11 or 12 million. Under in Trump's 4 years, the number was 1.5 million. And that's just going to be, and again, I'm not going to get into an argument about the merits of immigration or, you know, everything. He's just going to be able to hammer that message and say, I took care of the border. I kept the country safe in the process. I kept, you know, the economy. You know, you can talk about the economy too. The economy's strong, but you know, and under Joe Biden, the border is out of control. And he's made, you know, he made decisions on day one when he came into office, which essentially opened the border up, and there hasn't been a proper enforcement of it. And I think he was. So I think that's probably the overwhelming issue for him. And I do think, just to follow up, I do think he has the economy on his side, because he can say to people, you know, look what's happened to your real spending power in the last 4 years. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? For most people, it's not true.
I'd say, I mean, certainly immigration is, I wouldn't disagree, at least as an issue. Regardless of how one positions themselves, it's working in favor of him. I think rage. I mean, I think he plays to some of the rage in the electorate, and there is an anger, and he's good at tapping into that. And that's not new to him, but I think he does it effectively. And if he connects a sense of chaos that he argues exists in the world, whether it's because of the border, whether it's because of overseas, and he's the guy who's going to get angry for you, I think that's an asset of his. And I do think his ability to kind of understand and work within the modern media matters. He's very good at it. He understands elements of it. Maybe it's instinctive, maybe it's cerebral. I think it's just instinctive, that Biden is not quite as good at. And I think he capitalized on it very well in 2016. He capitalized on it as president. He's capitalizing on it even in handling the unprecedented trials he's going through right now and managing at some level to turn them into a campaign opportunity, to turn them into the campaign. It's kind of a remarkable insight, and I think that's his biggest asset. I think it always has been. It's not Trump or Truth Social. It's actually his understanding of the broader media. And that, I don't say that as a conspiratorial kind of argument. I don't think it's some subversive thing. I think he just gets the rhythm. He understood how Twitter could help drive what networks would cover and what newspapers would cover in a way most politicians didn't understand. They weren't separate. It wasn't simply about Twitter. It was about kind of a way to get other reporters to think about certain questions. And he will deploy all of that in the next. That's his best asset. He's not, especially with financial troubles, this is what he has. So I think that's his biggest strength.
Well, another question I think is of great interest to most people, which is now the independent vote tends to sway the election one way or the other. You know, the Democrats have their 30 or 40%, and the Republicans have their 30 or 40, but it's that independent vote which switches in one way or the other and decides the outcome of elections. The independent vote in this year, we're facing the question of what the suburban moms are thinking about. Where are the Nikki Haley voters going? How about all those wavering Democrats, both on the left and conservative part of the party, in terms of Biden, and also the so-called double haters, who both, those people who don't like either one, but you know, they may in the end decide where they're going to go in the final days. Any comment on that? I'll start with Gerard.
Well, I'm sorry to be sort of captious again, but independents are important. It's true, but actually they may not necessarily be as important as be the ability to turn out your own voters, and that's been absolutely critical. That was huge in 2020 for Joe Biden. It was independents, you know, in a relatively close election, but it was important that he was able to do that. The most striking example of it was Barack Obama in 2012, when the polling, almost up until polling day, the election was extremely close. I mean, the result was pretty close, but the key thing was Obama's campaign were able to get to the polls people who were Democrats, who said they would vote for Joe Biden, but had very, very low energy levels. They were very low, low incidence voters, but they got them to the polls. And I think that will be important again, Stephen, this year. I think the extent to which turnout, we had massive turnout in 2020, obviously particularly because of the special conditions that were allowed during the pandemic. We're going to have very similar conditions, I think, for early voting, mail-in voting, absentee voting, all that kind of stuff. So I think getting your own vote out is as important as the independents. On the question of independence, I think that right now the polling shows two really interesting things, actually. One is the number of people identifying as independents is much higher. It used to be, you're absolutely right, it used to be back in the 1980s and 90s, it was about 40. Democrats always had a registration advantage and an identification advantage. Democrats about 40%, Republicans about 35%, independents about 25%. It's now something like 35 Democrats, 30 Republicans, and about 33, 34 independents. So the number of people identifying as independents, oddly enough, in an age when we become much more polarized, has greater. The question is, what do they, do they vote? And a lot of them don't, because they're just not energized to vote. They vote in fewer numbers than people who identify themselves as voting as with one of the two main parties. And then the question is, who do they vote? Right now, the polling does show that Trump has an advantage among independents. It does depend on which poll you look at. There was a poll last week which gave Trump a 5-point overall lead. Among independents, he was leading by 16 points, 43 to 27. And again, that's primarily because of the issues. They all cite immigration, economy, the state of the world, state of defense, and that kind of stuff. So I think that's going to be as important. Or my only point is, it's going to be as important determining which of the two main candidates is able to drive their vote out. And secondly, then independents, and who do independents go for? And are they more influenced by issues, or are they more influenced by the character question? And I think that's right now they seem to be favoring Trump, but we're 6 months away, things could change.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a turnout election. Independents matter, but it's just not as relevant in the last few election cycles. Many independents will vote for one of the two parties that they previously had voted for. I think a lot of voters who express what did you call it, double haters, they'll end up voting for their party. I think that partisan imperative is very strong, and people come home at the end of the day. That's what happened in 2016, and it was, there was endless talk about would Republicans defect to Hillary Clinton, like in a Goldwater kind of election. It just doesn't happen anymore. So I think kind of driving up the vote is really the issue. I don't know if the third party is kind of the most interesting part, because that can affect that vote, either by dampening vote or kind of peeling away turnout voters to this third party. And is there going to be another candidate? That's one question. What will Kennedy? Will he have an effect? He is polling well, and he's polling well with it's unclear who he takes the votes away from. If you hear him enough and you put aside the vaccine issues, he's pretty liberal in terms of kind of his rhetoric, and even his vaccination arguments are connected to a more liberal argument about that. So I could imagine him peeling away votes in states like Michigan with younger voters that are going to be important. So I think the third party in some ways might end up having a bigger effect than independents.
Now, one of the interesting strategies being conducted in this campaign, which is really unique, is the so-called Trump's courtroom strategy, which is basically staying in the courtroom for most of the time that he should be out campaigning. Now, that seemed to have worked for him in the Republican primaries. And he played the victim card in a way that was very strategic in terms of attracting his old constituency in his own party. How effective is it going to be this time around? Or is it too difficult to imagine how this will work? I'll start with you.
I mean, if there's no convictions that take place, I think it can be very effective. I think it works. He knows how to use it. I think it gives him a lot of attention, which is key in campaigns. Every time one of the trial issues comes up, he's front and center. That happened. The primary opponents of his had a lot of trouble, not just countering his arguments, but even getting airtime, because this is a recurring story. And it will be the story, I think, in many ways in the next few months. The conviction is the wild card. If that happens, it's unlikely at this point, just the timing and the delay, but that is, at least in the polls, something that can hurt him. I don't think that changes. His narrative is very similar as it was in 2016, and the trials, he has found a way to fold into that. And I think a lot of the Republican electorate is okay or sympathetic to that argument. The one other place, other than a conviction, that it hurts is financially. And I don't think that's insignificant. There is an imbalance in the money that the two candidates have raised. A lot of Trump's money so far, and I realize he has a huge cash windfall that might come into him, but so far money is going toward the campaign, and it's basically being directed to the courtroom. And I don't think that helps him. And the money will matter. Money does matter in terms of campaign infrastructure and advertising. But putting those two parts aside, overall, I think he can continue to use this as his story. This is his story.
I think it depends very much on the sequencing of the trials as they take place over the course of the next 6 months. I think it's going to matter enormously which trials get the attention and which actually get heard, which cases get heard between now and the election. Setting aside the civil case and the defamation case here in New York, ranking the criminal cases that he faces, the 4 of them broadly, in kind of order of what I think I'll politely call credibility, as like real, real evidence of serious criminal activity. Ranking them in reverse order, let's do that. So I would say, I think the Alvin Bragg case here in Manhattan is, frankly, I have to say, I was the editor of the Wall Street Journal when we broke the Stormy Daniels story. I'm very proud of that story. We did a very good job with it, and Trump clearly is guilty of some wrongdoing. Well, I shouldn't say that. It looks like he's guilty of some wrongdoing. Is that really does Bragg really have a strong criminal case on that related to the, trying to connect state laws, which will be a misdemeanor at the state level, to a felony at the federal level? I think that's a really flimsy case, frankly. And the more that, and by the way, Trump is so lucky. One of the things we should never discount in politics or history is just luck, right? Napoleon said, didn't he, about his generals, he may be talented and capable and smart, but is he lucky? Trump is just lucky. And it looks like that case, the Alvin Bragg case, is supposed to start on April the 15th, I think it is. That's going to get a lot of attention. I think that's going to help Trump, quite frankly, because I think he's going to look like a zealous, Democratic elected prosecutor in Manhattan going after Donald Trump. The second case, rank again in reverse order of kind of credibility, is the Fani Willis case in Georgia. She's got problems. We've seen that drama play out over the last month. She's got problems. They may get to trial in that case, but her credibility has been quite badly damaged. And again, that's the other big case. The other case, criminal case, that is likely to be, at least probably going to be heard. The two then rising, the federal cases, where I think they are much more serious. I think the January, not the January 6th, the subverting the election case that Jack Smith, the prosecutor, has is a pretty serious, and there are some pretty serious and credible charges in that. And of course, the documents case, the Mar-a-Lago storing the documents where he shouldn't have been, is a very strong case. I think by any measure is a very, very strong case. It's pretty, looks to me, I'm not a lawyer, but you've read the case and I've read the evidence. It looks like a slam dunk. But again, to Trump's luck, it's quite possible those cases aren't really because of the Supreme Court action, because the Supreme Court's going to hear the immunity case, and there's another case related to these cases. They might not come up. So what we might have between now and November are two relatively weak cases in which a lot of the public will say, I don't really like this. I don't like the spectacle of Democratic elected prosecutors going after the Republican. And the two federal cases, which I think which are much stronger, just may not even be heard, or may not be heard until right at the end of the campaign. So it's going to depend on the sequencing. It's going to depend on the Supreme Court's decision. But I think it could continue to redound to Trump's benefit.
And I mean, it is remarkable just how much January 6th and everything surrounding it has at some level faded as a defining issue of Trump. I mean, if we went backwards to where we were when that happened, it was hard to imagine that it might be one among many issues going into 2024 when he was running again. And it would depend on even the sequencing of cases as opposed to what people saw right in front of them at a broad level as the factor. Would you reelect someone who is involved in this? But he has managed to do it. And I don't know if, I'm not convinced, the cases will resuscitate that politically in a way that really undercuts his candidacy as opposed to some of these other questions.
All right, we've reached the point where we're going to get questions from the audience. I see one hand up right here.
A two-part question. The first is, when Trump was president, he advertised, as you all said, that he's very good at doing, the stock market being at record highs. And so you can always take economic data any which way. But the fact of the matter is the stock markets are all saying Biden's the best president in history because they're way, way up and at the top of the range. So if you comment on that. The second point is that it seems to me 45 states are more or less irrelevant. Nobody gives a hoot about them, and they don't matter. They always go the same way, and they just balance each other off. And it's really an election about 5 states, and nobody's commented on that. And so I'd like your thoughts on the only states that really matter rather than 50 states, most of which nobody gives a hoot about.
I mean, on the stock market, frankly, it almost never factors. I mean, if it comes at a time of extraordinary economic boom, like the 1980s, when you're genuinely having an economic boom, the 80s and the 90s were both good examples of that. It really benefited Reagan in the 80s, and then George H.W. Bush, and then Clinton in the 1990s, particularly the 96 election, when the economy was. But it was the economy that was so strong, and the economy was helping lift the market. If you get a situation like you have now, where again inflation, the price level is a real problem, and people are concerned about it. Interest rates are at their highest level in 25 years. I don't think the fact that, the top stock market, which is anyway, in any case, largely being driven higher by 10 tech stocks, I don't think that really factors into voters' considerations. You're right about the states. There are probably, and there are anywhere between 7 and maybe 9 states that really matter. You can sort of reel them off, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia. I missed one probably. I can't forgive me. I've forgotten. Those are the key states. And right now, that's one thing we haven't talked about is the inbuilt electoral college bias in favor of Republicans. Trump, as we know, lost the popular vote in 2016 by 2.5 percentage points. Much more than George W. Bush did in 2000. But he won a fairly solid electoral college majority. He could well win again. The numbers add up pretty well, exactly like this. He could again lose the popular vote quite comfortably to Biden this time around, and still win the electoral college. And that, I think, and that's obviously because Democrats pile up huge numbers of votes in California, New York, because of the inbuilt bias towards states in the electoral college, because it's tied to the congressional representation, and they all get 2 senators. So the Republicans, it's a striking thing. We all know this. There's only once since 1988 has a Republican won the popular vote in a presidential election in the United States, and yet on three occasions, they've won the Electoral College vote. And so that could happen again. And so that's why those states are particularly important this time because, yeah, as you say, it doesn't really matter what happens here in New York. We know they're going to, Democrats, Biden's going to win New York, and we know he's going to win California. But those states, right now, all the polling indicates that Trump has a small lead in pretty well all of those states. There was a poll out today, actually, which sort of tipped that Michigan, maybe not. Biden may have a lead in Michigan, but pretty well everywhere else. Currently, Trump is leading. But again, we're 6 months out. That could change.
Yeah, I mean, and they're narrow leads. So the point, which gets back to the turnout, is that this was the mistake of 2016 for a lot of analysts, not seeing that a narrow lead can go either way, as opposed to it being solid. And I think it is worth remembering that Trump lost in 2020, but he did pretty well given the circumstances in some of these states where small numbers could have flipped this election. And again, context matters. This was in the middle of a pandemic, which many people felt was handled incredibly poorly. It was in the middle of really a lot of chaos, and yet, you know, he came close in some of these states. So now we're 4 years out. Biden's the incumbent. Biden will take a lot of heat in these places where Trump will not. And so I could imagine those states, and you named them all. I don't know if you said Pennsylvania too. But we won't know, and that's why this is a turnout election, and that's why polls right now, they're important. They give us a gauge, but what they're saying is this is close, and it's going to come down to those final weeks. Who has a better machine? This is where the money might be important. Who has a better turnout? Who has better canvassing? And who has the issues that energize people to say, I don't like the candidates, but by God, I'm not going to let the other party be in power because I want either stronger immigration or reproductive rights, pick your issue. But that could be very important, I think.
Nevada's the other state. By the way, since I became an American citizen, I've learned not to say Nevada.
Any other questions? Yes.
Not a question, it's a comment, which speakers and commentators are constantly talking about age. They could dilute that if they would bring out Benjamin Franklin was 84, Second World War, Adenauer, Churchill, Charles de Gaulle were all up there. It could dilute the fact of
Yeah, but can I just say, to paraphrase the famous Lloyd Benson quote in his debate with Dan Quayle, you know, I knew Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a friend of mine. Joe Biden is no Winston Churchill. And I think trying to pull off that, you know, by comparing him with Benjamin Franklin or Winston Churchill or even Konrad Adenauer is going to just induce belly laughs.
I mean, look, there's two parts. One is, do you agree that Biden, and the same with Trump, that the age matters? And I think there's some will argue that one or the two of them are more competent and less affected by age than some people suggest. Others would not. But the other, that is an issue. I mean, you can't get around. I don't think commentators going on air at this point saying Biden's, you know, not really hampered by age is going to fundamentally change. These perceptions have hardened, and they are out there. They're very real. And so I think the Biden campaign can't wish them away and really has to figure out a way to win despite them. And I'm not convinced it's coming from above. I think this is where voters are, for rightly or wrongly. I'm not saying rightly or wrongly, but they are out there and they're serious. It's a serious challenge that the Biden campaign has to face. Well, the way he shows it, he has to show it. I mean, I do think that's it's not someone like either of us saying on air something contradicting that poll. In the end, he has now several months to be out there and to try to demonstrate through action that the age issue is illusory, it's not relevant, and that voters shouldn't consider. He's the only one who can do it. There's not a single pundit who will change perceptions as much as the president, just disproving that on the campaign trail. But he'll have to go out, he'll have to be present. I think that's why concerns among Democrats that he's not have become important. He can't not be out there. Being out there in some ways is very important right now for
The
him.
State of the Union address also helped him a lot, I think. Yes.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, do you think there'll be a debate between Biden and Trump? And if so, what do you think the results of that will be?
I would think they'd want to debate each other. I think, I don't know if that will happen. I would imagine that Trump will feel emboldened that he can kind of take him on, and it would give him an immense platform to spread his message. And I think he has a confidence. He's not nervous about debating. And I think Biden also, at some level, at least I don't know, he wants to be out there and he wants to respond to the kind of stuff that Trump is taking. But I might be wrong, and maybe Trump is going to say, I don't really need to do it. And as he did in the primaries, he'll avoid it, and he'll just get his message out. I don't know which of the two would happen. I don't think either would win. I mean, I think there's a kind of illusion in some ways that we're in an older politics where things just don't swing anymore, meaning one side or another. So I imagine if there was a debate, maybe right after you'd have some strong preferences, but come a few days, everyone would be exactly where they were before. But that's my take.
Yeah, I think it's a high risk, especially for Biden. I mean, I think if I were advising Biden, I think it just is high risk because Trump, for all his inanities and crazy and ridiculous things he says, has got a kind of, some of you mentioned it earlier, he does have a stage, he has an ability to command a stage, has an ability to command the television. He has a real facility for that medium in particular. And Biden, and again, standing there for an hour and a half, trying to remain absolutely, because really on your toes. It could, and we all are familiar with those terrible moments that have, supposedly been so critical in elections. Whether it was Gerald Ford saying there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, or the famous moment when Reagan sort of floored Mondale with his, I won't exploit your youth and inexperience thing. Those moments they can, and with Biden not, again, I don't want to be, Biden obviously not at the peak of his cognitive strengths. I think it would be a tremendous risk for him to do it.
I think we have enough time for one more question. Okay, good.
Ed Swire, Foreign Policy Association. What do the odds makers in the UK say?
They tend to follow the polls, and I mean, I think they say right now they're just looking at the polls, and they think they give Trump a 55% probability of winning. But I think that's a very short-sighted look at the polls. A lot can happen, and I do think this key question of whether or not people, in the end, come out and vote, particularly, and how worried they are about what Trump might mean for democracy. I think that will change. But right now they give Trump a slight advantage.
And to that point, Trump is as unpredictable as anyone in American politics. So we have no idea, in addition to the trials, what he is going to do between now and November. We know pretty much what Biden will do at a certain level. But he is what creates instability in this election, probably more than everything I talked about. He is the instability. And to predict now and to take odds in March for a November election when we're dealing with one candidate who, I don't know, he could be on air right now saying something that is fundamentally disruptive. I don't think those kind of predictions will tell us much. Combined with the reality, these are close elections, not just 2016, 2020. They've been for a long time. 84, some would say, is really the last landslide we've had. We had a little bit after, but it's a close election. It's an unpredictable candidate, and so taking odds, it's not that useful at this point.
I want to sneak in one last question. If Trump loses, what will he do?
Rage against the machine. I mean, he won't go down quietly, if that's what you mean. It's not hard to imagine a replay of 2020, but on steroids, because now kind of those arguments have seeped into a lot of the Republican electorate, and there is a predisposition to seeing the election as biased that comes before his saying it. But I don't know. I always think in the end he really wants to be a media mogul, and now he has a huge company that would be much more fun for him.
I hate to end on a dark note, but I agree with that. I don't think Trump will accept that he ever loses. But I also worry that even if Trump wins, there will be a large number of people in this country, and and I don't just mean the far left and activists. There'll be a large number of people who will not think that that's an illegitimate election. They think this is a man who engaged in insurrection against the United States, who somehow managed to wriggle out of his legal problems out because of help from the Supreme Court or delay or all these other kind of things. And I think there will certainly be an attempt, by a lot of Democrats not to certify his election. Remember, everybody always remembers January the 6th and how awful that was in 2021. It is always worth remembering that in 2004, when George W. Bush won re-election, a relatively small margin, 120 Democrats declined to certify his election in the House of Representatives that year. Now, thank God they didn't engage in insurrection. But I think, imagine that's what they did in 2004 with someone like George W. Bush over some bogus claims about voting machines in Ohio. What are they going to do with a man who's narrowly elected president, because it will be a close result, who may win again the Electoral College and lose the popular vote, who is, in their view, and in a lot of people's view, an insurrectionist who shouldn't be, should be disqualified under the 14th Amendment or whatever other, moral law you want to cite? I think it's going to be trouble either way. I think there's going to be a lot of people in this country, from elected officials down to, hardcore activists, who are not going to accept the result either way, on both sides, and I'm worried.
Well, on that wonderful note, I want to thank our speakers. I think it's been a terrific evening, and I'm glad you all came tonight.
Thank you.